It is Monday in Holy Week, and so today for our reflection, I want us to reflect on a story from the Gospel, one that we actually find in two different places. Matthew has it in chapter 21, starting in verse 12. This happens immediately after the story of Palm Sunday. He says, "Then Jesus entered the temple and drove out all who were selling and buying in the temple, and he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves, and he said to them, 'It is written, my house shall be called a house of prayer, but you are making it a den of robbers.' The blind and the lame came to him in the temple, and he cured them." John's Gospel tells the same story, but he tells it in a different place. He tells it in chapter 2, starting in verse 13. He says, "The Passover of the Jews was near, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. And in the temple he found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and the money changers seated at their tables. And making a whip of cords, he drove all of them out of the temple, both the sheep and the cattle. He also poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. He told those who were selling the doves, 'Take these things out of here. Stop making my Father's house a marketplace.'" You know, sometimes to get the whole picture, you really need to hear two different tellings of the same story. Matthew and John both tell us that after Jesus entered Jerusalem, he went to the temple. And when he went there, he found people selling animals for sacrifice. Now, if you've read the book of Leviticus, and if not, I'm not suggesting you go do so right now, but if you read Leviticus, what you discover is that in the law that it tells us, that it teaches us, you see God invites and pretty much expects that everyone will be able to come to the temple, come to the altar, bringing their sacrifice. And in so doing, everyone can come and receive grace. And the way Leviticus describes it, if you couldn't afford to bring a bull, you could instead bring a goat. And if you couldn't afford a goat, you could bring a dove. And if you couldn't afford doves, you could bring some grain. The point was to bring something that you could afford. Now, some of those who were coming to Passover as pilgrims during this time, well, maybe they hadn't brought something with them to sacrifice. And so when they came to the temple, they would encounter what Jesus saw: the money changers and the animal sellers who had set up tables that were there making a profit, selling cattle and goats and doves to those who came to worship, to those who were coming seeking grace. John says that Jesus made a whip and drove them out, flipping their tables and dumping out their change. And Matthew tells us that he then stayed in the temple after that and healed the blind and the lame. In some ways it feels like two different stories, but it's really just two different sides of that one moment that go together. You see, this points out to us that it wasn't just Jesus losing his temper. Braiding leather into a whip takes time, it takes focus, it takes patience. This isn't the act of someone who is hot-headed and rushing in. And so you can imagine being one of the disciples watching Jesus carefully braiding a whip and asking yourself, what is he going to do with that? And then you watch what he does. You watch him go into the temple and upend the status quo. Not because he wanted to make a scene, but because there were people putting up financial barriers. They were getting in the way of grace. And Jesus' whole ministry and whole life was about removing the barriers and making grace more available. And so when he finished driving out those that had put up barriers, he stayed. And he healed those who came to him, those who in many cases might not have been able to afford what the money changers were selling, but they needed grace too. The poor, the hurting, the chronically overlooked, the blind and the lame, they needed love, and Jesus showed them love. In the world today, there are many that are still like these, and many obstacles still being put between them and the things they need. And so as we reflect on this first day in Holy Week, we remember Jesus braiding a whip and making a mess of the status quo, all in the name of widening the reach of God's grace and love. How is God calling us to be like this Jesus.